SUA, I gated my private lane for one afternoon. The HOA charter was revoked by Monday. How could closing a private lane for a single afternoon lead to consequences that serious for an HOA? And what could possibly connect one gate to the loss of an entire HOA charter? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are glad you are joining us for another story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Thank you sincerely for spending your time with us and for continuing to support the channel. Your support means more than you know. Before we get started, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let's begin the story. Open that gate, Ethan. Right now. Cynthia Barrett's voice carried over the metallic clank as I dropped the temporary steel gate into place across the gravel lane at exactly 2:15 on a Friday afternoon. I looked up from the chain in my hands and saw her standing beside a white sport utility vehicle, one hand pressed against her hip, the other holding her phone like she had already decided photographs would become evidence. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 51, worked as a grading and drainage contractor, and that lane had crossed my family's property longer than the subdivision behind Cynthia had existed. The August sun had heated the steel until it felt warm through my work gloves. Dust hung above the gravel where her tires had stopped, and somewhere beneath the road I could hear water trickling through the old culvert I planned to inspect. "Afternoon, Cynthia," I said. She pointed at the gate. "This is an HOA access road. You cannot block it." I rested one hand on the gate post. "Show me the easement." Her expression barely changed. "The association has always had access." "That is not the same thing. Residents use this lane every day. Some residents use it because I have never made an issue of it." Cynthia stepped closer, careful not to leave the gravel. "You do not get to suddenly decide community access belongs to you." I almost laughed at the wording, but I did not. Instead, I looked down beside my boot. Half buried in dry soil was the rounded top of an old iron survey pin, weathered brown with rust. I had seen it hundreds of times. My father had shown it to me when I was young enough to think property boundaries were fences instead of lines recorded on paper. That pin marked one corner of the parcel, and the lane ran exactly where our old surveys said it ran. "I am checking the culvert, grading the shoulder, and verifying the boundary this afternoon," I said. "The notice went up yesterday." Cynthia glanced toward the maintenance sign I had posted beside the gate. "The HOA never approved a closure." I did not ask the HOA. That finally changed her expression. "You need our authorization to interfere with community infrastructure. Then show me the document giving you control of it." For several seconds, the only sound between us was gravel ticking beneath the cooling tires of her vehicle. Cynthia raised her phone and took a picture of the gate. Click. Then another of the maintenance notice. Click. "I am contacting the county." I nodded. "Please do." She seemed almost disappointed that I had not argued. "They will make you open this." I checked my watch. "It will be open before sunset anyway. Then why close it at all?" I looked toward the shallow ditch where runoff had carved a channel beside the lane after the last storm. "Because it is my responsibility to maintain it." Cynthia shook her head, returned to her vehicle, and drove away, throwing a pale ribbon of dust behind her. I waited until the sound of her engine disappeared before looking down at the iron pin again. I had closed one gate for one afternoon to inspect a road my family had maintained for decades. Cynthia believed calling the county would prove I had crossed a line. What neither of us knew yet was that her complaint was about to make someone pull the records and ask who had crossed that line first. Long before Cynthia Barrett started calling it community infrastructure, that lane was simply the road my father taught me to maintain. It ran a little more than half a mile from the county road, curved past our lower field, crossed the old drainage culvert, and continued toward the acreage that eventually became Brookfield Ridge. When I was 12, my father would drive our faded pickup at walking speed while I shoveled loose gravel into washouts after summer storms. He taught me to watch where water collected, where tires pushed stone toward the shoulder, and where the ditch needed clearing before the next hard rain. Back then there were no matching mailboxes, no stone entrance monument, and definitely no homeowners association. Years later, when the subdivision was built behind us, the developer installed its main paved entrance on the eastern side. Our gravel lane remained private, but a few contractors occasionally asked permission to use it because it shortened their route. Then residents started using it. At first, maybe 3 cars a day passed my house. Nobody caused trouble, and I had no reason to turn neighborliness into a legal argument. That was my mistake. Permission has a strange way of becoming expectation when enough time passes. By the time Cynthia became HOA president, residents were calling the lane their secondary entrance. Then one spring morning, I found a green directional sign planted beside my ditch that read Brookfield Ridge Rear Access. Nobody had called me. I removed it, placed it in my barn, and emailed the association. Cynthia responded that the sign was intended to improve traffic flow. I wrote back that traffic flow did not change ownership. She never answered that sentence. 3 months later, an HOA landscaping truck came down the lane and trimmed brush along my shoulder. I stopped the driver and asked who had authorized the work. He showed me a printed work order from Brookfield Ridge. That evening, I started a folder. I kept photographs, maintenance receipts, gravel invoices, property tax records, and every email Cynthia sent me. I also found the old survey my father had stored with the deed. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cardboard when I unfolded it across my kitchen table. A black boundary line followed the same route I had known my entire life, and one notation pointed toward the iron monument beside the lane. The same rusted pin I had looked down at while Cynthia stood outside my gate. The next morning, Saturday, I drove the lane slowly with my truck window open. Tires pressed into fresh gravel with that familiar crunch I had heard since childhood. Near the subdivision end, I noticed something new attached to a wooden post, another Brookfield Ridge sign, smaller than the first, with an arrow directing residents toward the county road. I photographed it, but left it standing. I wanted Cynthia to put everything in writing before I made another move. I did not have to wait long. At 9:12 that morning, my phone chimed. An email from the HOA had arrived with a formal notice attached. Cynthia had signed it herself. The first paragraph ordered me to maintain unrestricted access. The second described the lane as established community infrastructure. I read those words twice, then opened my father's survey beside the letter. One document showed what the HOA claimed. The other showed what the county had recorded. For the first time, the disagreement was no longer something Cynthia could dismiss as a misunderstanding at the roadside. She had taken an assumption, printed it beneath the HOA letterhead, signed her name under it, and handed me exactly what I needed to start checking whether Brookfield Ridge had ever possessed the authority it was claiming. The sentence that bothered me most was not the demand for unrestricted access. It was the phrase established community infrastructure, because Cynthia had written it as though ownership could be created by repetition. Saturday afternoon, I spread everything across my kitchen table: my father's survey, the deed, the subdivision plat I had downloaded years earlier, property tax maps, gravel receipts, and Cynthia's signed notice. Rain clouds had rolled over the ridge, turning the windows gray, while the refrigerator hummed behind me. I traced the parcel boundary with one finger. The gravel lane crossed my land exactly where it always had. Brookfield Ridge's paved streets appeared clearly on the subdivision plat, but my lane sat outside those dedicated roads. I searched every page for language granting the association unrestricted access. Nothing. I checked again because I did not want to build my argument around what I hoped was true. Still nothing. On Monday morning, I drove to the county records office before heading to a grading job. The building smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. A clerk helped me pull the recorded plat, deed history, and easement index connected to my parcel. I spent nearly an hour reading descriptions that were dull enough to make most people quit after 2 paragraphs. Utility rights, drainage provisions, access language tied to older parcels. None of it matched the sweeping authority Cynthia had claimed. That afternoon, I called Laura Bennett, a property attorney I had worked with during a boundary dispute on a commercial project. I emailed her Cynthia's letter and every recorded document I had collected. She called the next morning. "Ethan, do not assume you have won anything yet. I am not. Good. We need a current survey and a complete title review. Historical use can create questions, and I want every fact documented before you restrict anything." That was exactly why I trusted her. She did not tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me what needed proving. I hired Michael Grant, a licensed surveyor who had worked in the county for 23 years. Wednesday morning, he arrived with a tripod, receiver, marking paint, and 2 field cases. The air smelled like damp soil from an overnight shower. Michael worked quietly, moving between recorded monuments while his equipment gave short electronic beeps. Near the gatepost, he brushed away loose dirt with his boot and exposed the rusted iron pin. "There is your old monument," he said. That tiny piece of metal had survived developers, storms, HOA boards, and decades of passing tires without moving an inch. By noon, Michael had enough field data to confirm what the older survey suggested. The disputed stretch of lane remained inside my parcel. Laura still wanted the title report before drawing conclusions about access rights, but the physical boundary was becoming difficult to argue with. That evening, another email arrived from Cynthia. She gave me 48 hours to confirm that I would not interfere with HOA access again. I forwarded it to Laura without responding. 10 minutes later, she called. "Let her keep putting the claim in writing," she said. "Meanwhile, we document everything." I looked through the window toward the lane, where the last light caught the gravel and the old gatepost cast a narrow shadow across the ditch. Cynthia thought silence meant I was backing down. What I was actually doing was measuring the distance between what she believed the HOA controlled and what the recorded documents could prove. The title report arrived Thursday morning while I was sitting in my truck outside a drainage project, and Laura's message beneath it contained only 6 words. "Call me when you are alone." I waited until my crew had started unloading equipment, then closed the truck door and called her. "I finished the chain of title review," she said. "I found utility easements and drainage rights, but I did not find a recorded easement granting Brookfield Ridge the unrestricted access Cynthia keeps describing." I looked through the windshield at a line of orange survey stakes beside the job site. "So the lane is private. The land is yours, and Michael's survey supports the recorded boundary. Access rights are a separate question, which is why we stay careful. No grandstanding, no permanent obstruction, no interference with emergency access or any independently established right." "Understood." Laura paused. "If you need to close the lane for legitimate maintenance, document the reason, provide notice, keep the duration reasonable, and photograph everything." That afternoon, Michael emailed his signed survey. I printed it at my office and laid it beside Cynthia's demand letter. Her document, called the Lane Established Community Infrastructure. Michael's drawing placed the disputed stretch squarely inside my parcel, with the old iron pin beside the gatepost marked as a recovered boundary monument. One line on paper had done what 3 weeks of emails could not. It separated assumption from evidence. I spent Thursday evening preparing for the culvert inspection I had already postponed twice. The last storm had washed gravel toward the ditch, and water had begun cutting a shallow channel along the shoulder. I photographed the drainage area, measured the washout, checked the gate hardware, and posted a maintenance notice stating that the lane would be temporarily closed Friday afternoon. I included the expected reopening time and contact information. Then I emailed the same notice to Cynthia and the HOA manager. Cynthia replied 11 minutes later. "The HOA does not consent to closure of its secondary access." I read the sentence twice and forwarded it to Laura. Her response came almost immediately. "Save that." Friday morning smelled like hot pine and dry gravel. I drove the lane before work, checking every sign and shoulder. At the subdivision end, Cynthia's little directional marker still pointed toward my property, as though the arrow itself created a legal right. I photographed it with the survey monument visible farther down the lane. At 1:45 that afternoon, I returned with my pickup, a shovel, marking paint, and the temporary steel gate. I placed the maintenance sign where approaching drivers could see it well before reaching the closure. Then I walked the shoulder one final time. The culvert water made a low, hollow sound beneath the road. At 2:15, I swung the gate across the gravel. Metal met the latch with a clean clank. I had barely removed my gloves when tires approached from the subdivision side. Cynthia's white sport utility vehicle appeared through the dust. She stopped 20 feet from the gate, stepped out, and stared first at me, then at the maintenance notice. "You actually did it. Until the work is finished." She lifted her phone. "I told you the HOA does not authorize this." I pointed toward the survey copy clipped inside a clear sleeve on the post. "And I asked you for the recorded easement." Her jaw tightened. "I am calling the county." I nodded. "Please give them my number." She took photographs while I returned to the culvert. By 4:30, the shoulder was graded, the drainage channel was cleared, and the gravel had been reset. Before sunset, exactly as promised, I swung the gate open again. The lane had been closed for only one afternoon. But somewhere between Cynthia's phone call and the county record system, The question had already changed from why I had closed my road to why her association kept claiming it belonged under their authority. By Friday evening, the gate was open again, the culvert was clear, and fresh gravel sat neatly along the shoulder, but Cynthia's complaint had already started moving through offices neither of us could see. At 6:12, while I was washing dust from my hands at the utility sink, my phone rang from a county number. The caller introduced himself as Thomas Reed from the County Land Services Department. "Mr. Cole, we received a complaint concerning obstruction of an access route serving Brookfield Ridge." I dried my hands and leaned against the counter. "The lane was temporarily closed for maintenance this afternoon. It reopened before sunset. Do you own the parcel containing the closure?" "Yes." "Do you have documentation?" "A current license survey, deed records, photographs, and a title review." There was a short pause. "Could you email those tonight?" "Absolutely." I sent everything within 20 minutes, including Cynthia's signed demand letter describing the lane as established community infrastructure. Laura told me not to editorialize. "Documents first," she said. "Let their own records answer the questions." Saturday morning, Thomas called again. His tone had changed. "Mr. Cole, I reviewed the survey and recorded plat. I need clarification on one point. Does the homeowners association maintain this lane?" I looked through my kitchen window at the gravel shining beneath the morning sun. "No, I maintain it." "Do they pay you for maintenance?" "No." "Did they install the culvert?" "My father and I replaced it years before Brookfield Ridge existed." Another pause. Then came the question that mattered. "Why does the association describe this road as infrastructure under its control?" "You would have to ask them." He thanked me and ended the call. 20 minutes later, Cynthia emailed me. The subject line read County Complaint Follow-up. She wrote that Brookfield Ridge expected unrestricted access while county officials reviewed my obstruction. I forwarded it to Laura. "Do not answer," she said. Around noon, I drove to the hardware store. The lane was completely open. 2 Brookfield Ridge vehicles passed me without delay. Nothing looked dramatic. That was what made the situation strange. Cynthia had complained about a closure that no longer existed, but the county was still asking questions. At 3:47, Thomas emailed requesting copies of any HOA signs, notices, or correspondence referring to the lane as community property, secondary access, or association-controlled infrastructure. I opened my folder. There was the photograph of the green rear access sign, the landscaping work order, Cynthia's emails, the formal demand. I sent all of them. Sunday afternoon, Laura called while I was spreading leftover gravel near the gate post. "Ethan, something changed." "What?" "The county contacted the association's registered agent for organizational records." I stopped the shovel halfway through a pile. "Because of my lane?" The lane triggered the question. Apparently, the recorded property documents do not match some of the representations the association has been relying on. "What representations?" "I do not know yet." "Do not speculate." I rested the shovel against the gate post. The iron survey pin was visible beside my boot, exactly where Michael had found it. That little piece of metal had not accused anyone of anything. Neither had the deed. Neither had the survey. They simply existed. Sunday evening, another message arrived, this time from Brookfield Ridge's management company. Monday's regular board meeting had been replaced by an emergency administrative session. Cynthia sent nothing. For the first time since this started, her inbox went completely silent. I stood outside as daylight faded over the lane. A car rolled across the gravel toward the subdivision. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Nobody stopped it. Nobody needed to. The gate was open. The road was open. Yet somewhere inside the county's files, officials were no longer investigating what I had done for one afternoon. They were investigating what Brookfield Ridge had been claiming for years. Monday started with a phone call before I had finished my first cup of coffee. Laura's name appeared on my screen at 7:18. I answered while standing at the kitchen counter, still looking through the window toward the open lane. "Ethan, the county review expanded yesterday evening," she said. "Expanded how?" They compared the recorded subdivision documents with organizational filings Brookfield Ridge has relied on for years. Your road is not the only inconsistency they found. I set my coffee down. What else? I do not have the complete file yet, so I am not going to guess. What I can tell you is that the association's claimed authority over certain infrastructure appears broader than the property rights reflected in the recorded documents. That sounded complicated, But the principle was simple. Brookfield Ridge had been treating a line on somebody else's land as though it belonged inside their jurisdiction. Once the county checked that line, they started checking the others. At 8:30, Thomas Reed emailed me a formal request confirming that my Friday closure had been documented as temporary maintenance on privately owned property. He asked one final question. Had Brookfield Ridge ever shown me a recorded easement supporting the unrestricted access Cynthia demanded? I answered with one word. No. By 9:15, Laura called again. Their registered agent has been asked to produce the original charter materials and supporting property representations. I walked outside. Morning dew darkened the gravel, and water whispered through the freshly cleared culvert. Why would the charter matter? Because an association cannot create property rights merely by describing private infrastructure as part of its operational territory. If foundational filings relied on inaccurate representations, the reviewing authority has to determine whether the organization was properly constituted under those filings. I looked toward the subdivision entrance in the distance. For years, Cynthia had spoken as though the HOA letterhead transformed every statement beneath it into law. Now somebody was reading the paperwork behind the letterhead. At 10:42, a Brookfield Ridge board member named Robert Hayes called me. I had met him twice at neighborhood cleanups. His voice sounded exhausted. Ethan, did you file something against the association? No. Cynthia says your attorney challenged our charter. Laura did not challenge your charter. Cynthia reported my gate to the county. Silence. That is what started this. As far as I know. Robert exhaled slowly. We are in an emergency meeting. Our attorney is asking why the original filings describe access routes that do not appear on the recorded dedication. I leaned against the gate post. The steel was cool beneath my palm. Robert, I cannot answer that. Neither can we. Around noon, Cynthia finally called. She skipped the greeting. You knew this would happen. No, Cynthia. You closed the lane knowing we would contact the county. I closed my lane for maintenance after giving notice. You chose to make the complaint. You are playing with words. No, I am being precise. Her voice dropped. People could lose the association over this. I looked down at the rusted survey pin beside my boot. Then maybe the question is why the association depended on property it did not own. She said nothing for several seconds. When she finally spoke, the certainty I had heard at the gate was gone. We have operated this way for years. That does not make the paperwork correct. The call ended shortly afterward. At 2:16, almost exactly 3 days after I had closed the gate, Laura forwarded me a county notice. The review had been referred to the state office responsible for the association's organizational registration because the issue potentially affected the validity of its charter filings. I read the notice twice. My lane was mentioned only once. It was no longer the main subject. The gate had opened Friday evening, but Cynthia's complaint had opened something much larger, and unlike my steel gate, nobody at Brookfield Ridge could simply swing this one back open and pretend nothing had happened. By late Monday afternoon, nobody at Brookfield Ridge was talking about my gate anymore. Laura called at 4:26 while I was checking a drainage trench at a job site. I stepped away from the equipment and listened as she explained what the state reviewer had found in the association's organizational records. The problem is broader than the lane, she said. The original charter materials appear to describe several access and common infrastructure areas as though they were under association control, but the recorded property documents do not support all of those descriptions. I stared across the job site at a row of survey stakes standing perfectly straight in the dirt. So somebody assumed the paperwork matched? That is one possibility. Do not assume intent. What matters is that the state is comparing representations against recorded ownership. She emailed me the public portion of the review notice. I read it inside my truck. My gravel lane appeared beside references to a drainage strip, a utility turnaround, and another narrow access corridor near the western edge of Brookfield Ridge. The association had apparently treated all of them as pieces of one community infrastructure system. But the recorded maps told a different story. Some belonged to separate parcels. Some were subject to limited rights that did not match the authority described in the HOA records. My lane was simply the easiest contradiction to verify because Michael's fresh survey placed the boundary beside a monument that had been sitting there for decades. At 5:15, Robert Hayes called again. Our attorney just asked who prepared the original charter exhibits, he said. Do you know? The developer's management company, apparently. Cynthia did not create them, but she has been relying on them. That distinction mattered. This was no longer about proving Cynthia dishonest. It was about proving whether Brookfield Ridge possessed the authority its board had been exercising. Robert lowered his voice. Cynthia keeps saying we have operated this way for years. I remembered her saying exactly that to me. Robert, years of doing something do not rewrite a recorded boundary. He was quiet, then said, that is almost exactly what the reviewer told us. Around 6, I drove home through the main county road instead of entering from the lane. Several residents were gathered near the Brookfield Ridge clubhouse. I did not stop. I had spent enough time around disputes to know that speculation grows faster than facts. At home, I walked down to the gatepost. Evening heat still rose from the gravel. The iron pin sat beside my boot, dull and unimpressive. I thought about how absurd it seemed that something so small could contradict years of official-looking letters. Then Cynthia's vehicle approached slowly from the subdivision. She stopped on the open lane, but remained behind the wheel. The state says our charter may be defective, she said through the open window. Laura told me there is a review. They are questioning whether the association had the jurisdiction described in the original filings. I heard. Cynthia looked toward the survey pin. Her expression was tired rather than angry. Do you understand what happens if they invalidate it? Not completely. Contracts, assessments, management authority, enforcement. Everything becomes complicated. I nodded. Then your attorney should handle it carefully. She looked at me as if expecting something harsher. I had nothing to give her. You could tell them residents have always used this road. I already told the county the truth. People have used it. I also told them I maintain it, and nobody ever showed me an unrestricted HOA easement. Cynthia looked ahead through the windshield. Usage is not ownership, she said quietly. Hearing my own argument come back in her voice felt stranger than winning one. She drove away without another word. That night, Laura sent me one final message. The state reviewer had scheduled an expedited determination for Monday morning based on the organizational filing discrepancies. I closed my laptop and listened through the open window as tires crossed the gravel outside. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The lane was still open to every neighbor passing through. But the authority Cynthia had treated as permanent was now balanced on documents that could no longer survive one simple question. Who actually owned what Brookfield Ridge had claimed as its own? Monday morning arrived with low clouds hanging over the ridge and the smell of fresh coffee filling my kitchen. At 7:43, my phone vibrated against the counter. Laura's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. Ethan, the determination was issued. Something in her voice made me set my mug down. What did they decide? The state concluded that the organizational charter cannot remain valid under the filings currently on record. The discrepancies in the supporting property representations were material to the authority described when Brookfield Ridge was organized. I stared through the window toward the lane. The steel gate stood completely open. You are saying they revoked it? Effective this morning, yes. The association has been directed to cease exercising authority under that charter while the property owners and council determine the lawful structure going forward. For several seconds, I heard nothing except the refrigerator behind me and water moving faintly through the culvert outside. Because I closed the lane? No, Laura said immediately. Keep that distinction clear. Your closure caused Cynthia to file the complaint. The complaint caused officials to examine the records. The records caused this. That mattered more than anything. I had not discovered a magic loophole. I had not asked the state to destroy an association. I had maintained private property, documented my boundary, and answered questions truthfully. Brookfield Ridge had supplied the rest. At 8:11, an email reached every homeowner. The management company announced that normal enforcement activity and new assessments were temporarily suspended pending legal guidance. By 8:30, vehicles were gathering near the clubhouse. I stayed home. At 9:17, Cynthia called. Her name remained on my screen for 3 rings before I answered. Ethan, she said. There was no command in her voice this time. What did you do? I looked outside at the gatepost and remembered her standing there Friday afternoon with her phone raised. I closed my gate. You know that is not what I mean. Then the answer is nothing. I did not challenge your charter. Your attorney sent documents. Because the county asked for them after you reported me. Silence settled between us. Cynthia finally said, people are blaming me. I am not interested in blaming you. The association could have handled the lane internally. I tried asking for the easement. She exhaled slowly. I believe the charter gave us authority. That is why records matter. The call ended without an argument. Around noon, Robert stopped by my property carrying a copy of the determination. He stood beside the gate and looked down at Michael's survey monument. This little pin started all of this. No, I said. It was here long before any of us. I tapped the folded determination in his hand. The paperwork started it. The pin just refused to agree with the paperwork. Robert laughed once, quietly, then looked toward Brookfield Ridge. We are forming a temporary homeowners committee to keep basic services organized while the attorneys sort things out. Nobody knows what comes next. Probably a lot of reading. Apparently, we should have done more of that years ago. After he left, I drove my pickup down the lane to inspect the shoulder after the weekend traffic. The tires pressed into the gravel with the same familiar rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Nothing about the road looked different from Friday. The culvert carried water. The gate remained open. The rusted survey pin remained beside the post. Yet the letterhead Cynthia had treated like unquestionable authority no longer carried the power it had carried 3 days earlier. I stopped the truck, stepped out, and rested my hand on the steel gate. Friday afternoon, Cynthia had told me the county would prove I had crossed a line. By Monday, the county and state had found the line all right. It was just drawn around the HOA instead of me. 3 weeks later, the steel gate was still standing beside the lane, but I rarely closed it. There was no reason to. Brookfield Ridge residents continued driving through when appropriate. Only now nobody pretended courtesy was ownership. The temporary homeowners committee worked with attorneys to establish what property actually belonged to the community, what rights were recorded, and what arrangements needed legitimate agreements. Cynthia was no longer speaking for the neighborhood. She had stepped away from leadership while the residents reorganized, and the last time I saw her, she was walking near the clubhouse without the folder she used to carry everywhere. She gave me a small nod. I returned it. That was enough. I had never wanted humiliation. I wanted one question answered correctly. Who had authority over my land? On a cool Saturday morning, I loaded several bags of gravel into my pickup and drove toward the culvert. Autumn leaves had collected along the ditch, and overnight rain left the road dark and clean. My tires made the familiar sound as I rolled forward. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I stopped beside the gatepost and started filling a shallow depression near the shoulder. Halfway through the work, my shovel scraped the soil beside the old iron survey pin. I crouched and brushed the dirt away with my glove. The monument looked exactly as it had when my father showed it to me decades earlier. Rusted, ordinary, patient. It had been there before Brookfield Ridge existed, before Cynthia became president, before anyone planted a rear access sign beside my ditch. The line had never moved. People had simply stopped checking where it was. Robert Hayes drove up around 10 and lowered his window. Committee meeting this afternoon, he said. We finally have accurate maps for every parcel. That sounds useful. He smiled. You would be surprised how exciting accurate maps have become around here. Before leaving, he told me the residents were discussing a written access agreement for limited use of the lane, including maintenance responsibilities and clear protections for my ownership. That was the first proposal anyone had brought me that started with permission instead of entitlement. Send it to Laura, I said. If it is fair, we can talk. After Robert left, I finished spreading the gravel and leaned my shovel against the gate. Sunlight broke through the clouds and flashed across the steel. I remembered Cynthia standing on the other side that Friday afternoon, telling me the county would force me to open it. The strange part was that she had eventually gotten exactly what she threatened me with, official scrutiny. It just did not confirm what she expected. Her complaint made the county pull the survey. The survey led them to the association records. The association records led to the charter filings. And those filings could not support the authority Brookfield Ridge had been claiming. I never filed a campaign against them. I never searched for a way to dismantle their organization. I maintained a culvert, measured my boundary, saved my paperwork, and refused to confuse confidence with legal authority. Before heading home, I swung the gate completely open and secured it against the post. Metal clicked softly against metal. The lane stretched ahead through the trees, quiet and unchanged. That was the part one appreciated most. Justice had not arrived with shouting or revenge. It arrived through surveys, deeds, records, and one rusted pin that refused to move simply because somebody with a title insisted the line belonged somewhere else. I closed that lane for one afternoon. What ended their authority was everything they had claimed about it before I ever touched the gate.